It had been 2 long months since Andrew left for his military training. Jennifer had spent the time trying to distract herself from the growing feeling she had been battling for so long. The quiet of the house felt unbearable without him. His absence left a strange emptiness that she couldn't quite shake. Despite her best efforts to ignore it, Jennifer found herself longing for him in a way that she couldn't explain. She knew it was wrong, but she couldn't help the way her heart reacted every time she thought about him. When the day finally came that Andrew was returning home, Jennifer found herself restless, pacing around the house, unsure of what to do with herself. The thought of seeing him again brought an unexpected rush of emotions, and her heart raced with both excitement and anxiety. She had missed him more than she realized, and now that he was coming back, things felt different. Jennifer stood by the window, looking out toward the driveway, waiting for the sound of a car pulling up. The minutes felt like hours, and every little sound seemed to make her heart jump. Then, finally, she heard the familiar sound of tires on gravel. She didn't need to look twice to know it was Andrew's car. Her breath caught in her throat as she walked toward the door. When she opened it, there he was, standing in front of her. Andrew was in his military uniform, looking taller, more defined. His time away had changed him, and she couldn't deny the way it affected her. She had always thought of him as the boy she had raised, but now, standing before her, he was undeniably a man. "Jen," he said softly, his voice deep, and the way he looked at her made her heart race. His eyes locked onto hers, filled with emotions that mirrored her own. "Andrew," Jennifer replied, trying to steady her breathing. Her heart was pounding in her chest, and she felt her pulse quicken as he took a step closer to her. Without thinking, Andrew reached out and pulled her into his arms. Jennifer's body tensed at first, but then, she melted into the embrace. His warmth, the strength of his body, the scent of his cologne, it all felt so familiar, yet so new. She had missed him so much. The way he held her felt like nothing she had ever felt before, and her mind raced, her emotions tangled. "I missed you," he murmured into her hair, his voice thick with emotion. Jennifer's breath caught in her throat as she breathed him in, the sensation of his presence overwhelming her senses. Her body seemed to react to him, and she couldn't ignore the warmth growing between them. "I missed you too," she whispered back, her voice shaky. Her hands found their way to his chest, instinctively pressing against him. She felt his muscles under his uniform, the tautness of his body. The heat between them was undeniable. Andrew pulled back slightly, his hands moving to cup her face. He studied her with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. Jennifer's heart was racing now, her body responding to the closeness. She felt her breath become shallow as he leaned in just slightly, his face so close to hers that she could feel the warmth of his breath on her lips. There was a brief pause, a moment where neither of them moved, both of them caught in the unspoken tension that had been building between them for so long. Jennifer's body felt like it was on fire, her skin tingling with the proximity of Andrew's. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her lips, and her heart seemed to pound louder in her chest. And then, without warning, Andrew leaned in. His lips brushed against hers gently at first, tentative, as though testing the waters. Jennifer's breath caught in her throat, her body trembling slightly from the contact. His lips were warm, soft, and the kiss, though hesitant, held a promise that both of them were too afraid to acknowledge. Jennifer's hands moved up, sliding to the back of his neck, pulling him closer. The kiss deepened, more urgent now, as if they were both afraid that if they pulled away, the moment would slip through their fingers. Andrew's hands slid down her back, pulling her even closer to him. His body was hard against hers, the heat between them growing more intense with every passing second. Jennifer's head spun with the feel of his lips on hers, with the overwhelming rush of emotions and sensations that had been building for so long. She couldn't think, couldn't stop herself. Everything about this moment felt so right, even though it was wrong. Her hands moved down his chest, feeling the taut muscles beneath the fabric. She could feel his heartbeat, thudding in time with her own. Every inch of her body seemed to respond to him, to the way his lips moved against hers, to the way he touched her. Her fingers brushed the side of his face, tracing the line of his jaw before slipping into his hair. Andrew let out a soft groan against her lips as she deepened the kiss, his hands now moving to her waist, pulling her even closer. His lips traveled from hers, grazing along her jawline, trailing down her neck. Jennifer closed her eyes, tilting her head back to give him more access, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts. The sensation of his lips on her skin, the heat of his body pressed so close to hers, was almost overwhelming. She could feel herself losing control, caught up in the moment, in the heat of the desire she had kept buried for so long. It felt like everything she had been holding back was finally coming to the surface. "Jen," Andrew whispered, his voice husky and filled with a hunger that mirrored her own. His hands moved lower, trailing along her hips, and Jennifer gasped softly, feeling the heat of his touch radiating through her clothes. Jennifer opened her eyes, locking gazes with him. Her pulse was racing, her body on fire. She knew this was dangerous, knew it shouldn't be happening, but she couldn't stop herself. The connection between them, the intensity of their emotions, was undeniable. "Are you sure?" she whispered, her voice trembling as she looked up at him. Her heart ached with longing, but also with fear. She wasn't sure if she was ready for the consequences, but the desire between them was too strong to ignore. Andrew's hand gently cupped her face, his thumb brushing over her cheek. "I'm sure," he said softly. "I've never been more sure of anything." And with that, he kissed her again, more deeply, more urgently this time. Jennifer responded immediately, her body pressing against his as she let go of everything she had been holding back. As their kisses grew more passionate, Jennifer knew that things had irrevocably changed between them. But in that moment, with his hands on her body, with his lips on hers, she couldn't bring herself to regret it. This moment, this connection, was all-consuming. And for once, Jennifer allowed herself to feel everything, without fear, without hesitation. The heat between them intensified, and Jennifer's senses were overwhelmed. She could feel Andrew's strong arms wrapping around her, holding her as though he never wanted to let go. His touch was both tender and urgent, a mix of passion and yearning that sent waves of excitement through her body. Jennifer's hands slid down his muscular back, feeling the ridges of his shoulders and the hard planes of his body beneath the fabric of his uniform. She could hardly believe he was really here, that the man she had been longing for was finally in front of her, kissing her, touching her with such intensity. The kiss deepened again, this time without hesitation. Andrew's hands began to roam, carefully at first, as though testing the waters. His fingers gently traced the curve of her waist, slipping beneath her shirt to feel the soft skin of her back. Jennifer gasped into his mouth, the sensation of his touch sending a jolt of electricity through her body. She felt her skin flush, the heat rising inside her. She couldn't hold back anymore. She needed him, needed this connection that was so much more than just physical. She pulled away slightly, her breath coming in ragged bursts as she looked up into his eyes. They were filled with desire, but there was something more there too, an intensity that reflected her own emotions. "I've wanted this for so long," she whispered, her voice trembling with both longing and fear. "But, is this really what we should be doing?" Andrew paused for a moment, his hands still resting lightly on her hips. The look in his eyes softened, and he cupped her face gently, brushing his thumb over her cheek. "Jen, I've been wanting this too. I've tried to push it away, but every time I thought of you, every time I was away, I couldn't get you out of my head." Jennifer's heart swelled at his words. She had tried to convince herself that her feelings were just a phase, but hearing him admit he felt the same way made everything feel real. She wasn't imagining it. The attraction, the pull between them, it had always been there. "I just don't want to regret this," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper as she moved closer to him again, her body instinctively leaning into his. She needed to feel him, to be close to him, but a part of her still held back, afraid of the consequences. Andrew leaned down, his lips brushing against hers in a soft kiss, as though reassuring her. "We won't regret it," he said, his voice low and sincere. "This feels right, Jen. We can take it slow, just let things happen." Jennifer nodded, her body trembling with anticipation as she pressed closer to him. She felt his lips travel down to her neck, his warm breath sending shivers down her spine. Her hands moved to the back of his neck, threading through his hair, pulling him closer. She felt his lips against her skin, gentle at first, then growing more insistent as his hands slid up her sides. Her pulse quickened, her body reacting to his every touch. The desire that had been simmering for so long was now consuming her, and she couldn't stop herself. She needed him, needed to feel his touch, his presence in a way she had never allowed herself to before. Andrew's hands slid lower, tracing the curve of her hips before pulling her closer, his body pressing against hers. Jennifer could feel the undeniable heat between them, the way their bodies seemed to naturally align. She tilted her head back, giving him better access, and he took advantage of the moment, kissing her more deeply. She felt a rush of warmth flood through her as his lips moved down her throat, his hands moving to the small of her back, pressing her even closer. Her breath came in shallow gasps as the intensity between them continued to build. She could feel his heart pounding, the rhythm of his breath matching hers. Every touch, every kiss, seemed to pull them deeper into this moment, into a space where nothing else mattered. Jennifer's hands moved to his chest, her fingers fumbling with the buttons of his military shirt. She wanted to feel him, to be closer to him. She needed to touch him, to make sure this was real. As the buttons came undone, she slipped the shirt from his shoulders, revealing the toned muscles beneath. Her eyes roamed over him, her hands reaching out to trace the lines of his chest and arms. She marveled at the way he looked, strong, yet so familiar, like the boy she had known and loved, now transformed into the man who was standing before her. Andrew watched her with a mixture of desire and admiration. He leaned down to kiss her again, his hands moving to her back, his fingers teasing the edge of her shirt. Jennifer let out a soft sigh as she pulled away, her eyes locking with his. She could see the hunger in his gaze, but also something deeper, a tenderness that made her heart flutter. "I want you," she said softly, the words coming out before she could stop them. The vulnerability in her voice made her cheeks flush, but she couldn't take them back. She wanted him, wanted this moment more than anything, and the fear that had held her back before melted away. Andrew's expression softened, and he kissed her forehead gently. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice full of tenderness, as though seeking her approval, even though his body was clearly telling him otherwise. "I'm sure," she whispered back, pulling him closer again. This time, there was no hesitation, no second-guessing. She wanted to feel his lips, his hands, all of him. She wanted to lose herself in him. As their kisses deepened, the rest of the world seemed to fade away. The only thing that existed was the warmth of their bodies, the softness of their skin, the heat of their passion. Jennifer's hands roamed freely over his body, exploring, learning, feeling everything that made him the man he had become. And Andrew, just as eager, explored every inch of her, pulling her closer, savoring the feel of her beneath his touch. The tension that had built between them over the past few months was finally being released. Jennifer had longed for this, and now that it was happening, it felt more intense, more real than she had ever imagined. The connection they shared was something beyond the physical, it was emotional, deep, and raw. As their kisses slowed, Jennifer rested her forehead against his, both of them breathless, their hearts pounding in unison. She felt safe in his arms, but also completely exposed, vulnerable in a way that was both terrifying and beautiful. "I never thought this would happen," Jennifer said quietly, her voice full of wonder. "Neither did I," Andrew replied, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw tenderly. "But I'm glad it did." Jennifer smiled, her heart swelling with emotions she couldn't put into words. She didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, with Andrew's arms around her and his lips against hers, she didn't need to know. All that mattered was the connection they had, and the love they shared.